Hi folks, this will probably be the last video I do before I head off to the wilds of Europe. I'll put more information at the end. And it's a video version of a blog I just put up. There's an old Buddhist story called The Parable of the Poisoned Arrow, and it goes like this. Suppose a man is wounded by a poisoned arrow. His friends take him to a surgeon to have the arrow taken out. Suppose that man should say, "I will not let this arrow be taken out until I know who shot me, which caste he is from, what is his name, whether his complexion is black, brown, or golden, from which village he comes." That man would die before the arrow was taken out. I think we need a revised version of this for today's America. Suppose a man is wounded by a poisoned arrow, and his friends take him to a surgeon to have the arrow taken out. Suppose that man should say, "I will not let the surgeon take this arrow out until I know all about the surgeon. Is the surgeon a Republican or a Democrat? Is the surgeon pro-life or pro-choice? Is the surgeon white or a person of color? Is the surgeon lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, demisexual, pansexual, or straight? I must know the surgeon's preferred pronouns. I must know what gender the surgeon identifies as. I must know whether the surgeon is an ally of genderqueer beings and people of color." That man would die without ever knowing any of these things. Buddhism in America today has become largely identified with so-called progressive politics. A number of prominent Buddhist centers on the coasts have aligned themselves solidly with the leftist political agenda. Alongside their meditation classes, they offer other classes with names like Overcoming Whiteness and the Patriarchy, and they get together to write open letters opposing President Trump. It's almost expected that a Buddhist teacher must be on board with the left-wing political agenda because they are Buddhists. I'm certain that many Americans ask these very questions I put in my rewritten version of the arrow parable in order to decide if they want to listen to a particular Buddhist teacher. They imagine that in order to be qualified as a Buddhist teacher, you must have the correct views on subjects such as these. But is Buddhism progressive? And are the political views of Buddhist teachers really as relevant as some people seem to think? Folks who run these coastal Buddhist centers seem to think so. Otherwise, why would they go out of their way to make sure everybody knows where they stand on these issues? In some ways, perhaps we could say that Buddhism is progressive. For example, the Buddha accepted all castes into his order of monks. He also accepted female students. This was pretty radical in the India of his day. Not everybody did that. So we might say that he was proto-progressive in terms of race and gender matters. Buddha also had nothing to say about the morality of same-sex relationships. I mean, he did say that monks and nuns had to be celibate, and he had to clarify and make sure they understood that that meant same-sex relationships were forbidden too. But as for the general population, he had nothing to say about the morality of same-sex relationships. So maybe we could say he was progressive on that issue as well. However, I think the reason that the Buddha accepted all castes and all genders needs to be clear. It was because he didn't think these things had any bearing at all on what he was trying to teach. In the original version, the arrow parable was used to point out that knowledge of metaphysical matters like the existence of God and the origin of the universe and whether or not there is life after death were irrelevant to someone whose main concern was how to alleviate the suffering inherent in the human condition. I've rewritten the parable to point out that the politics of a Buddhist teacher are also of no significance if what we want to learn from that teacher is how to alleviate our own suffering. My ordaining teacher, Gudo Wafu Nishijima, was a political conservative. He was definitely not right-wing. He used to say, the right wing is wrong and the left wing is also wrong. But he liked George W. Bush, and he spoke favorably about then Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi's visits to the Yasukuni Shrine. And the Yasukuni Shrine was this shrine that honored the war dead of Japan during World War II, and it includes people who were convicted of war crimes. This bugged me a lot at the time. More than once, I stopped coming to his talks because I couldn't deal with his politics. Now, I want to be clear. Nishijima Roshi never talked about politics and never gave his opinion on a political matter unless somebody specifically asked him for it. He didn't make politics part of his Buddhist teaching, and he was always very, very clear that his politics were not part of Buddhism. The fact that he was always clear about this difference between politics and Buddhism is probably why I continued to go to him, even though I disagreed with a lot of his politics. He didn't care whether his students agreed with his politics. He knew that wasn't why we were there. I don't think the same can be said for a lot of our American Buddhist teachers. Some of our American Buddhist teachers, and I won't name any names here, seem way more interested in politics than they are in Buddhism. And they don't seem to know that there is any difference between politics and Buddhism. Buddhism in America was initially embraced by the 60s counterculture movement and members thereof. Some of these people became our first native-born Buddhist teachers, and they brought their politics with them to their Buddhist teaching. And yet, when I look at the overall history of Buddhism, I don't see a lot of politics in there. For example, in Dogen's voluminous writings, I can't recall seeing any mention of politics except for maybe a couple of times he would talk about a samurai who donated some money to him or something like that. That's about it. To read Dogen, you'd think there wasn't much politically going on in Japan in his day. And if you thought that, you would be completely wrong. Dogen's father was a politician, and he was assassinated, probably in part for his political views. During Dogen's lifetime, Japan underwent a major civil war, a devastating famine, and a massive militarization of its legal system. One of the reasons Dogen gave for moving his monastery from nearby Kyoto, which was then the capital of Japan, to an outlying area way off in the mountains, was because the rivers were full of blood and corpses from all the fighting that was going on there. That's how politics was done in his day. And yet Dogen never wrote about politics. And while he didn't have a Twitter account or a 24-hour news cycle to keep track of, it would be ridiculous to imagine that he had no idea what was going on politically around him, especially when his family and some of his major supporters were deeply involved in it. In fact, very little of the Buddhist literature of the past concerns politics, and if you read that out of context, you'd think that in places like ancient India, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and elsewhere, nothing was going on politically. That's crazy. It was like the Game of Thrones over there. But I think a lot of contemporary Buddhists, especially in America, really do read it that way. They may not express it directly, but they seem to assume there were no politics for Buddhists to worry about back then. I've even seen people going on Twitter saying things like, we need to get political because we have all these political things that are going on nowadays, as if nothing political was ever going on for Buddhists in the past. I think the reason that the Buddhists stayed out of politics was because they knew that, as Sting so eloquently said, there is no political solution to our troubled evolution. Buddhism is seeking to deal with something far deeper than politics. Intensive Buddhist practice requires a level of dedication that precludes serious involvement in political matters. Even so, Buddhism only exists in places where the political climate is relatively stable. Dogen had to run off to the mountains to practice because things were so unstable in the cities. He didn't do it because there's some great virtue in starving half to death and freezing up there. In fact, it would have been easier for him and his monks to practice if all their basic needs could have been easily met. They went to the mountains to escape and get to solitude and quiet. When Buddhists in Asia have been political, they've mainly tended to be pretty conservative. They're usually not right-wing, although some of that exists, unfortunately. But they're more just kind of plain conservatives. I think this is because Buddhists in Asia generally see conservatism as being the best way to preserve the social stability necessary for Buddhist practice. Political progressives often call for rapid and radical societal change. Such rapid societal change doesn't usually make societies more stable. In fact, it tends to destabilize them. We are, after all, animals, and no animal fares well when its environment changes too quickly for it to adapt. Buddhist practice itself is all about slow incremental change. Compared to most political movements, change that Buddhists are looking for progresses glacially slowly. It makes perfect sense that Buddhists would prefer slow change in politics as well. I really hope that as Buddhism grows in the West, it continues to attract more and more conservatives. I'm glad to see a lot more conservatives joining the Buddhist fold, and I'm happy that I am able to be a part of that. I think it's only when we get more conservatives into the Buddhist movement that we'll see a shift away from this focus on radical politics and a shift more towards what Buddhism is supposed to be all about. That's it. Here's where I'm going to be in Europe. All these places and events and things are open to anybody who wants to come. No experience necessary, so please show up. There's more information on hardcorezen.info/events. So you can go there and get all the info and links and things to how you can join. As always, I am dependent on your support through Patreon and PayPal. The links are below. I'm not making a lot of money going to Europe. I just get by and bring like a few dollars back. So I still depend on your support. Thanks very much for that, and see you later. Probably talk to you next time from Europe. Bye.